Welcome back to Winning Isn't Easy. Let's talk about the similarities between Ehlers Danlos Syndrome and complex regional pain syndrome and an ERISA disability claim. Now, those of you who suffer from both medical conditions are saying, why on earth is Nancy Cavey asking, are there similarities? Because I don't really think there are any similarities based on my symptoms. So let's answer that question. Let's start out with a proposition that disability insurance companies hate cases like Ehlers Danlos Syndrome and complex regional pain syndrome because of the absence of objective diagnostic testing, overlapping disease symptoms, and their own particular bias about the nature of these diseases. Now, as I've said before, this is applicable regardless of whether you have Ehlers Danlos or complex regional pain syndrome. This is the approach that disability carriers take. But for the purposes of this discussion, let's consider the nature of both diseases. So let's talk first about complex regional pain syndrome, or CRP. It's an acquired neuropathic pain syndrome. It's diagnosed by using what's called the Budapest criteria. There's no gold standard test to diagnose this disease, and it has its own classifications. There's type 1, which is without the presence of a nerve injury, which is more common. There's type 2, which is the presence of a nerve injury. And both types 1 and 2 are systemic diseases that can impact any organ or any symptom. And it's also thought, by the way, to have a genetic component. So now we get the basics, if you will, of complex regional pain syndrome. Let's contrast that with Ehlers Danlos syndrome. Ehlers Danlos also has a genetic component. In fact, it's a genetic connective tissue disorder that's caused by defects in the collagen that can lead to joint hypermobility and laxity in the skin, ligaments, joints, eyes, bones, and blood vessels, and even internal organs. It's characterized, as chronic pain syndrome is, by chronic pain. It's diagnosed by using the Brighton diagnostic criteria as there is no gold standard test. The lack of objective testing and the use of diagnostic criteria that doesn't rely on gold standard testing makes these types of disability claims suspect in the eyes of the disability carrier or a plan administrator. So your medical records, just like in any other medical condition, have to explain the basis of the diagnosis, be it CPR or Ehlers Danlos syndrome. So let's talk about the overlapping symptoms. The diagnostic criteria for both CRPS and EDS, Ehlers Danlos Syndrome, are in part based on your subjective symptoms. And guess what? Disability carriers or plans are going to question not only the existence of, but the severity of your symptoms. In the case of these diseases, it can include something called allodynia, which is even air or light touching will cause extreme pain, hyperalgesia, tremors or myoclonus, heightened sensitivity to light, sounds, touches, and odors, poor concentration, poor short-term memory, chronic pain, headaches, GERD, and IBS symptoms, urological issues, skin issues, tinnitus, thyroid dysfunction, a whole host of symptoms, some of which overlap with chronic regional pain syndrome. And I will tell you, regardless of either, the disability carrier is going to look at those medical records for the symptoms. And it's important in both instances, both diseases, to document the frequency, nature, and intensity of your symptoms and do that with particular detail about how these symptoms impact your ability to do your own or any occupation. Now, one of the other things I think both of these diseases have in common when it relates to an ERISA disability claim is in disability insurance carrier or plan bias. Many carriers or plans have position papers on how they view these types of diseases and explicit instructions for how a claim is to be evaluated. And these position papers become the roadmap to a claim denial or termination. The decisions that they make are bolstered by the carrier's plan or the carrier or the plan's use of biased medical peer review doctors, who I call them liar for hires. Now, many times what happens is that these medical reviewers don't even believe in CRPS, the diagnostic criteria, or the idea that it can be disabling. And they kind of poo-poo EDS claims on the basis that, notwithstanding all of the symptoms, including laxity, dislocation, that you ought to be able to do something because you've got a brain. Now, they will often question the restrictions and limitations assigned by your physicians. So the carrier is going to question the diagnosis, question whether or not the condition is disabling, question the restrictions and limitations. And in doing so, as I've said, they're going to be relying on these position papers that they've created. They're going to rely on liar for hire doctors, who in turn are going to rely on unreliable medical journals and reports to substantiate the ultimate conclusion that they make. And they're going to stack all of this medical documentation, and the carrier is going to say, hey, either we don't accept the diagnosis, or yeah, we accept the diagnosis, but it doesn't, your symptoms aren't consistent, or your symptoms do not rise to the level of severity that will result in disability. So what should you do if your claim has been denied or terminated? You need to understand that under the ERISA law, you're only going to have 180 days in which to file an appeal. And if you don't file an appeal, you're giving the disability carrier an easy win. You can see that these claims, CRPS claims, EDS claims, are medically, factually, and legally complex. It's a very difficult area, if you will, because of the carrier's position papers and their bias. Now, these denials and terminations can be overcome, but as you can see, it's going to take a lot of work and documentation. Got it? All right, let's take a break.